When you think of figures who changed the course of the 20th century, Mao Zedong stands out as one of the most influential and controversial. To some, he was the visionary who unified China after a century of humiliation, chaos, and foreign domination. To others, he was a ruthless tyrant, responsible for policies that caused famine, political persecution, and the deaths of tens of millions of his own people. Mao's legacy is a paradox. He was both the father of modern China and one of history's deadliest leaders. Mao Zedong was born in 1893 in Shaoshan, a small village in Hunan province. He grew up in a peasant family. Though his father had become relatively prosperous by Chinese rural standards, Mao was a rebellious young man uninterested in farming. He studied Confucian classics, but was more inspired by stories of rebellion and military heroes. The late Qing dynasty was collapsing, and China was being torn apart by internal weakness and foreign imperialism. As a teenager, Mao witnessed the 1911 revolution that toppled the Qing dynasty and established the Republic of China. But the Republic was unstable, plagued by warlordism and corruption. These formative years convinced Mao that China needed radical change. Mao eventually embraced Marxism, inspired by the success of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. In 1921, he became a founding member of the Chinese Communist Party. His path from rural youth to revolutionary leader had begun. At first, the Chinese Communist Party was small and weak. It allied with the nationalist Kuomintang led by Sun Yat-sen and later Chiang Kai-shek to fight warlords and unite China. But the alliance collapsed when Chiang turned on the communists in 1927, launching a bloody purge that forced Mao and his comrades into hiding. It was during these years that Mao developed his strategy of peasant-based revolution. Unlike orthodox Marxists, who believed the urban working class would lead the revolution, Mao believed China's vast peasantry could be mobilized as a revolutionary force. From bases in rural areas, Mao's forces launched guerrilla warfare against the nationalists. The defining episode of this struggle was the Long March of 1934 and 1935. After suffering devastating defeats, Mao and around 8,000 Red Army soldiers set out on a grueling retreat across thousands of miles of rugged terrain. Only a fraction survived, but the Long March became legendary, cementing Mao's leadership and giving the CCP a powerful myth of resilience and sacrifice. When Japan invaded China in 1937, the communists and nationalists formed a fragile united front against the invaders. Mao skillfully used this period to expand communist influence, especially in rural areas, by portraying himself as a champion of resistance, while the nationalists struggled with corruption and internal divisions. After Japan's defeat in 1945, the uneasy alliance collapsed into full-scale civil war. Against all odds, the communists triumphed. In 1949, Mao stood in Tiananmen Square and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. For millions of Chinese, it seemed like the dawn of a new era, an end to foreign domination and national humiliation. Once in power, Mao moved swiftly to control land reform campaigns, redistributed property from landlords to peasants, often accompanied by violent purges. The communist state eliminated political rivals, silenced dissent, and established a one-party dictatorship. At first, many Chinese welcomed Mao's rule. He promised equality, social justice, and modernization. Women were granted new rights arranged, marriages were discouraged, and education expanded. Mao cultivated a personality cult, presenting himself as the wise and benevolent leader guiding China to a brighter future. But beneath the surface, Mao's China was built on fear, surveillance, and repression. Political opponents were labeled as counter-revolutionaries, and often executed intellectuals who questioned the party were silenced. By the mid-1950s, Mao was undisputed master of China. In 1956, Mao surprised many by launching the 100 Flowers campaign, encouraging intellectuals to speak freely and criticize the government. For a brief moment, writers, professors, and students voiced their frustrations about censorship, corruption, and the inefficiencies of communist rule. But Mao quickly turned on them. The brief flowering of free speech was followed by a harsh crackdown. Critics were denounced, imprisoned, or sent to labor camps, it was a classic bait-and-trap strategy. Lure out dissenters, then crush them. In 1958, Mao launched his most ambitious and disastrous project, the Great Leap Forward. His goal was to rapidly transform China from an agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse capable of surpassing the West. Peasants were organized into giant collective farms and ordered to produce steel in backyard furnaces. Mao believed sheer willpower could achieve miracles. Officials inflated production numbers to please their superiors, creating the illusion of success. In reality, it was a catastrophe. Crops failed due to poor planning and forced collectivization. Grain that did exist was often seized by the state, leaving peasants to starve. Local officials, terrified of admitting failure, covered up the crisis. Between 1959 and 1962, famine swept across China. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 20 million. Some historians believe it could be as high as 45 million. The Great Leap Forward remains one of the deadliest man-made disasters in history. Yet Mao refused to accept responsibility, blaming natural disasters or accusing peasants of hoarding food. By the mid-1960s, Mao's grip on power had weakened. More pragmatic leaders in the Communist Party were steering China toward economic recovery, sidelining Mao's radical vision. But Mao was not ready to fade into the background. In 1966, he launched the Cultural Revolution, a campaign to reassert his dominance and purge so-called bourgeois elements from Chinese society. Mao called on young people to form Red Guards and attack the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. The movement spiraled into chaos. Students turned on their teachers. Families were torn apart as children denounced their parents. Temples, books, and cultural treasures were destroyed. Millions were persecuted as enemies of the revolution. Intellectuals were humiliated in public struggle sessions, beaten or driven to suicide. The economy stagnated. Schools closed and social order collapsed. Mao encouraged the chaos, believing it kept his rivals off balance and reaffirmed his ideological purity. By the time the Cultural Revolution wound down in the mid-1970s, it had left China scarred. Millions suffered, and the nation had lost a decade of stability and development. Mao Zedong died in 1976 at the age of 82. His body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum in Beijing, where it still attracts visitors today. His death ended one of the most turbulent eras in Chinese history. After Mao's passing, his successors, most notably Deng Xiaoping, quietly dismantled many of his policies. They introduced market reforms, opened China to foreign investment, and steered the country toward modernization. Deng famously declared, "It does not matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice," signaling a pragmatic break from Mao's ideological rigidity. Yet Mao's image has never disappeared. In China, he is still officially celebrated as the founding father of the nation, the man who ended centuries of humiliation and unified the country. His portrait hangs over Tiananmen Square, and his face is printed on every banknote. But the darker side of his rule, the famine, the purges, the Cultural Revolution, is often downplayed or ignored in official narratives. Historians estimate that Mao's policies directly or indirectly caused the deaths of between 40 and 70 million people, making him one of the deadliest leaders in history. So how should we understand Mao Zedong? Was he a liberator who gave China independence and dignity, or a tyrant whose reckless policies killed millions? The truth lies in the paradox. Without Mao, modern China would not exist in its current form. He unified a fragmented nation, expelled foreign powers, and gave China a new identity. But his obsession with ideology and power also inflicted unimaginable suffering on his people. Mao's story is a reminder of how revolutionary ideals can turn into authoritarian nightmares. A leader who began as a champion of the oppressed ended up becoming one of the greatest oppressors of them all. Today, China is a rising global power, its economic and political influence stretching across the world. But its foundations were built during Mao's turbulent rule. His face still watches over Beijing, a symbol of both pride and pain, of progress and destruction. Mao Zedong will forever remain one of history's most controversial figures a man who sought to remake a nation, and in doing so left behind both the birth of modern China and a legacy of tragedy measured in tens of millions of lives.